Okay, go on.
Oh, you've talked about it already or something?
Yeah, I already talked about the Celtic stuff.
Yeah, anyway. Um, so it's a great courses about the Celts in general. And then it goes into some specifics. So it's fairly long. I think there are 24 lessons on it. Half hour. They're half-hour lessons, right?
No, no.
So it'd be something like 12 hours of material. That's maybe a third of a university course or something like that. A semester course. So it's pretty impressive. She seems to know the stuff, seems to like the stuff. I don't think she necessarily comes from a Celtic background. Maybe that's better. Be kind of objective about it. I don't think they give the Celts credit enough for depth of 7. One thing she doesn't talk about is the Cimmerians, or Gomer as they're called in the Bible, Gimmerai as they're called in the Assyrian annals. It's Cimmerian is a Greek term. You see, that's related to a lot of words for some types of Celtic people, like the Welsh. Cymric, I think, is the language they're supposed to speak. Their own word for it. And I think Cumberland is another name, for Celtic type of people, or in the kind of the northern part of England. And then there's one tribe. What were they called? Cumbrians? Cambria is another name for Scotland. You can see how it's got that CMB thing. And Cimmerian, see, like it has a what would be a gemination.
Is that why Cambridge is called that?
Well, that's a bridge over the Cam River.
Oh, so it has nothing to do with that.
Not necessarily. Might have. But what you'd be looking for is an R at the end, right? Okay. But that's a good guess, right? Because you're seeing that sort of stuff. That's farther south and in an area that was more settled by the English. I think it'd be more like Cambridge. I got to think more Anglian. What is it? The term Angles. So Anglia, the Saxons tended to settle more in the south. But so Cambridge is kind of like in the middle part of England, or middle south. Anyway, it's just the Cimmerians messing around 700 BC in present-day Turkey. But, 500 years later, there were Galatians in the middle of Turkey. You see how Galatian might be related to Gaul or Gaelic and stuff like that. And they figure those Galatians were Celtic. So it's just, these groups would spill out and be pests for their neighbors every so occasionally. I'm afraid that's where I'm part Celtic, so significant part Celtic. So maybe I can speak freely. I think that by times most culture groups have been pests for their neighbors. So
I don't know. You see, we're watching the Vikings things now.
Yeah.
And after I had wondered about the Celtic people and the violence and this and that, and see the other side of the art and the music and whatever. And then, so you kind of wonder about these things, especially when you have ancestors of whatever. Anyway, so now we're watching the Viking thing, and the Viking Great Course. We'll talk about that later. We're almost finished up. I kind of feel like if you had the neighbors that were, they're not actually Vikings, I guess that to go out Viking is when you were going out raping and pillaging and stuff. So
From place to place,
Yeah.
I think that's what it means.
so it's
Vik means
I guess
place.
it's not appropriate to call them Vikings.
No,
but
I don't think anyone complains about it, but
I don't think anyone does.
yeah. You know,
Um,
like if you can't take what other people call you, like get over it.
And honestly, if you were raping and pillaging and brutalizing your neighbors and stuff, then suck it up.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
So, anyway, so I have a very different perspective now because I used to think, well, Scandinavian people, they were peaceful and this, and I had no idea. No, not. So, maybe the Celtic
And,
people started
I can-
collecting
you know,
skulls
the
just
Vikings
to try to scare them away.
Yeah, well, the thing is, the Celtic people spilled out of their native homeland. You know, there's no way they belonged in Turkey. So they were bumheads when they were, pardon my pidgin French.
Yeah, you're right about that.
You know, same sort of thing with the Vikings. And now I'm part Germanic and, as I recall, part Scandinavian, very small parts. Maybe I can speak freely about it. They generally were major league bumheads. So they had a right maybe to conquering Iceland because apparently there was no one there, you know, except the maybe there were hawks. I don't think they had penguins.
Seabirds.
Yeah, exactly right. So
Walrus.
yeah. Anyway, yeah, for a long time they were bumheads, and then they were converted to Christianity, and they became somewhat better. Now they tend to be quite a bit better. They tend to be social democrats, but they're kind of turning into antisocial, anti-democrats and stuff like that. They've turned right-wing, and of course that's because a lot of the guys, social democrats, they were social anti-democrats. They were kind of identifying with, with noble, what they'd see as noble savages and stuff like that. Yeah, you know, there's no such thing as a noble savage. You know, like they're not savages and they're not noble. So, you know, designation's ridiculous. That goes back to a silly person called, at least, Rousseau. Stupid fool.
So I don't know. Yeah. Is that all you wanted to talk about the
Yeah,
Celts?
pretty well.
Yeah, James wanted to share some stuff because he hadn't finished going through the book, so now he's finished going through the book. So he wanted to talk about the Celtic stuff a little bit before, because we have to return it
Sometime today.
Yeah. So
Anyway, it was a pretty good book. And it was interesting to see. I'd already had a fair idea of what was like. But
well, it's incredible how much you know about this stuff because.
I was kind of saying that when they were saying stuff like they
Well, no, like I've heard you talking about the Vikings before, and a lot of the stuff that he's going through. I mean, he knows a lot. The instructor that's going through the Viking stuff.
No,
wow.
Yeah, it's
But
awesome.
but a lot of the stuff you had told me in the past, so that's
The
awesome.
Vikings are a little less interesting because you see the
Well,
Celts.
it's pretty interesting.
Well, what I mean is they don't. History doesn't go that deep.
Mm.
The Celts go back to at least 500 BC when they're interacting like with the Romans, whereas the Vikings really don't start rolling until 800 AD. That's 1,300 years later. Now, I think I found, like I say, the records exist there already, but other people have discovered it too. The connection between Celts and the Middle East, going back to 700 BC. A little bit earlier than that, 750. So. But the interesting thing about the Vikings is when they started stirring, they started stirring something like 793 AD, that's the exact year, and 792, somewhere around there, and it looks as though the world might have been hit by a piece of a comet or a large meteorite somewhere between that time, going back to 750 BC. I can't recall the exact date. And if an impact like that was large enough, it would spew junk up into the atmosphere. That might cause harvests and stuff like that to be not as good as they would be ordinarily, and it might get people just looking for other greener pastures, shall we say. And of course, there'd be no guarantee. They'd be going all over the world, right? As far as they could reach, trying to find a place. Other places, of course, would be having troubles too. But if you're in the northern hemisphere, I think it would affect you more, because if you got a blanket of...
So you think that's when they started being rough?
I knew that even before.
Okay. So maybe I'm not being fair, thinking...
Well, you see, they were just rougher than other people. Well, the thing is, they were doing it at the expense of other people, right?
Yeah, I know.
And it went on and on and on.
Yeah, they just liked the habit too much.
Yeah, exactly right. So their hash didn't really get settled until over 200 years later, when they were converted to Christianity. So even after they were converted, like William the Conqueror, I suspect, was at least a normal Christian, and he was a Norman. That means Norseman. He was a Viking, descendant of Vikings who conquered the northern part of France. So Normandy is named after those people, and they were not nice people. William the Conqueror was not nice. People that followed after him were not nice in Ireland. They weren't nice in Scotland, and junk like that. So, like even today, aristocratic names in England some of them tend to be like Fitzgerald, Fitzpatrick, Fitzhugh, on and on it goes. What's the significance of that? Well, that's actually a French name, a mispronunciation, misspelling of a French name. Fils Hugh, Fils Patrick, Fils Gerald or Gerard. It's a French name, and that comes from the people who came with William the Conqueror after. So even now, I see that aristocratic strain, French, but ultimately Norman, still survives. They still think of themselves as aristocrats and people who have a right to rule over other people and dominate them and exploit them economically in other ways. So it's amazing how long that lasts. That's almost 1,000 years ago. So, anyway, I'm interested in the Vikings, just not as because of this possibility that starting to. This is a pattern I think I've noticed in history. Is there'll be an environmental stressor, some sort of impact from the outside in the solar system, or else some sort of volcano, a serious volcanic eruption. That's enough to get people stirred up all over the world. And it happened roughly 1850 BC, roughly 1150 BC, I think that was volcanic, and with 1850 BC, it's almost certainly, I've got records from Greece, Egypt, from the Hebrews, from the Mesopotamians, from the Indians, South Asia, and from the Chinese, that indicate it was something that came from the solar system, a comet that still exists, actually. Only part of it.
Well, we will talk about the Vikings later today.
We will, exactly right.
Yeah.
But what happened, like around 750 AD, was just minor by comparison with this other stuff that I mentioned. Even by comparison with something that happened about 200 years earlier, about 534 AD, it looks as though a comet hit a small one. Hit the world. It's very small. It stopped the world's trees effectually growing for about 5 years, and that would have affected. It helped the Dark Ages set in for about 100 years, and it resulted in at least one. What happens is the crops start failing and stuff like that. People, they worship the gods or a god, and then they kind of get sick of worshiping after a while. And what happened around 650 BC was amazing, because you see the world's trees in essence stop growing. The tree rings are so thin now. They stopped growing for 18 years in a row. 18 years in a row. You can imagine what happened to religions. And so Karl Jaspers, a thinker, or some people call him a philosopher, about 100 years ago, called this the axial age. And what he meant by that was it was kind of like an axis, like there was a turning. There was a turning from old gods to newer gods, or turning away from gods when we're looking at Greek thinkers who tended to be atheists or agnostics or something like that. So it kind of makes sense. You pray to the gods for 18 years and you finally get sick of them not answering or giving you bad answers. But there was one major religion that happened after, in the wake of this thing, 534 AD. It was founded by a guy they figured was born 570 AD. His name was Muhammad. So that was a major league turning in world history, religions, but nothing like what happened 650 AD. And that makes sense because 5 year world's trees and hence crops and other things not growing. Grazing land not growing.
Yeah,
18 years it makes it would be way worse. Anyway,